Why do atoms form bonds? There are several types of bonds: ionic, covalent, and polar covalent. Let's talk about ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are when one atom gives electrons up to another atom. An example is NaCl. Sodium is the cation and chlorine is the anion. Sodium has 1 electron and chlorine has 7. For chlorine to complete its shell, sodium gives chlorine the 1 electron. See if you can do this example of calcium chloride. In this example, calcium gives 1 of its electrons to each of the chlorides. Now each chloride has 8 electrons. Next are covalent bonds. These are when atoms equally share electrons. One example is methane, or CH4. Here, carbon equally shares its electrons with all 4 hydrogens. This is an example of CO2. Carbon is double bonded to the oxygens to complete its shell, and the oxygens have 4 electrons added to them to complete their shells. The final type of bonds are polar covalent bonds. This is an unequal sharing of electrons amongst atoms. Here is an example of this kind of bond with CO. After the bonding, let's look at each atom's formal charge. Carbon usually has a charge of +4, but in this case it's -5, leaving it with a formal charge of -1. Oxygen could potentially have a +6 charge, but in this case it's -5, leaving it with a formal charge of +1. Let's move on to electronegativity. 0.4 and 1.7 are very important numbers. Electronegativity is an atom's ability to attract shared electrons to itself. Here is the electronegativity chart on the periodic table of elements. The electronegativity ranges corresponds to the type of bond atoms make. 0 to 0.4 indicates nonpolar, 0.4 to 1.7 indicates polar, and anything above 1.7 indicates ionic. An important rule in chemical bonding is the octet rule. In the octet rule, atoms want 8 electrons in their outer shell. In this ionic bond situation, barium gives its 2 electrons to oxygen for oxygen to complete its shell, and barium no longer has an incomplete shell. In this covalent problem, we had 4 electrons to sulfur in the Lewis dot structure, so sulfur can complete its shell. Finally, let's talk about molecular and geometric structures. There are 3 key rules to molecular structures. Rule 1. Each bond equals 1 electron domain. Rule 2. A lone pair is every 2 unbonded electrons on the central atom. Rule 3. Each lone pair of electrons equals 1 electron domain. So back to the original question. Why do atoms form bonds? One reason is to complete their full outer shell. This is synonymous to the octet rule and can be obtained by ionic, covalent, and polar covalent bonding. The other reason is stabilization. This means each atom wants to have a stable electron configuration. And this is how and why atoms form chemical bonds.